Today we're going to discuss a very important topic, domestic violence, the impact it has on its victims, what to do if you witness or know about it, why people stay, and why emotional abuse and control is also domestic violence. Welcome to the panel. Before we start, remember to subscribe and click the bell, and if you want to be on a panel, click the link in the description below. So domestic violence is a major public health problem and a violation of human rights. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 3 partners around the world will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. Our panelists today are Lizbeth Meredith, award-winning author of Pieces of Me, Rescuing My Kidnapped Daughters, speaker and former probation officer and domestic violence advocate, who currently teaches a course on Udemy on how to help if someone you love is being abused. Leslie Morgan Steiner, New York Times bestselling author of Crazy Love, columnist for The Washington Post, TED Talk speaker, and domestic violence survivor. Kerry Schafer, bestselling author of Whisper Me This, a novel about domestic violence written under her pen name Kerry Ann King. She's a speaker, coach, and Creativity Quest podcast host. Dr. Steiner, author of All the Silent Spaces, speaker, survivor, and advocate for cultural change around the way society addresses violence and equality. So could you please tell us your experience with domestic violence and how you came through it to the place of safety that you experience today?
Well, in my case, I was 22 and I had just graduated from Harvard, and I was living in New York City and working at 17 magazine. And I met a wonderful man who had also just graduated from an Ivy League school, and he worked at a big investment bank. And I fell madly in love with him very quickly. And we got married very quickly. And he first abused me 5 days before our wedding. I married him anyway because I thought that it was an anomaly. It would never happen again because he loved me so much. And during the 4 years that we were together, he beat me regularly. He pushed me downstairs. He held loaded guns to my head. And it took me a very long time to leave him, to even realize that I was a victim. And what really saved me was that I had 2 very kind and caring friends who realized what was happening to me. And they didn't rescue me, but they confronted me. And they helped me break down my denial and figure out that that this was not love and that I needed to leave him. And so I eventually was able to leave him and start my life over at 27. And since then, I wrote a memoir about it called Crazy Love, and I did a TED Talk on why victims stay. And I just have to say that I wouldn't wish this on anybody, but I'm very proud that I survived it and that I've been able to talk openly about it. And I don't think any victim should ever be ashamed of being hurt by somebody who he or she loves.
So I also met someone at the age of, I think it was 21, and married within months, and didn't see any of the warning signs that were coming toward me or that I was experiencing. Didn't see anything. Just came from a family where control and abuse in a relationship was not surprising whatsoever. It was almost like I was completing a family tradition. And I literally thought as a young person, I had 2 kids pretty quickly, 2 beautiful daughters, but I thought leaving the abuse would make the abuse end. And what I found 4.5 years after I left my husband was that was just the beginning. And I think the powerful lesson I learned was that a victim can make a whole bunch of great choices, but that doesn't mean that the end is going to be happily ever after. And so it was years after I left my husband. I'd gotten my journalism degree, had a wonderful job as an advocate. 4 years after leaving, when my kids were taken on a visit, and my former husband fled the country with them. And while I am so glad today that my daughters are back and that, yes, I have a memoir and I still work in probation, but I'm getting close to retiring, I've been very fortunate. It's really important in my world to remember that domestic violence isn't just about women making better choices, and that it's really important that we all have a role in helping solve the problem of domestic violence and advocating for one another when necessary.
For sure, Lizbeth, I
I hear what you're saying, and it just it hits me hard. My mother grew up in a domestic violence type situation. They never called it that. It was just grandpa was just really hard to get along with, you know, that kind of thing. But I've seen the impact on the family, and I'm also a mental health counselor, and I've worked with so many clients who have come from that situation. And what I remember is one time when I was sitting in the office just looking at my client, and she's looking at me, and her abuser was getting out of prison and still had rights to see their child. She said, the cops aren't going to get there fast enough when he comes for me. I don't know what I'm going to do. And so just for me, that realization of not only how many people go through it, but the difficulty of getting out. And even when you do get out, are you still going to be safe, and what can you do? Really hit hard for me. And that's one reason why I wrote the novel that I wrote, which grew out of a question is, what makes a woman leave? And then what happens?
I have, so I was molested as a child by a beloved, somebody that my whole family loved. And one thing that I didn't realize was that domestic violence actually includes events such as molestation. I thought it was only, domestic violence was only related to somebody who was an adult, but it actually involves children as well. And so I have an interesting story with violence. I was molested at around 8 or 9 years old, and then raped at age 21. And then when my kids were 3 and 5, I was attacked in front of them in a parking lot and beaten up in front of both of my kids. And it was only at that point that I decided to explore violence. I was pretty much convinced that the other two experiences had no effect whatsoever on me. And it was only seeing this event through my children's eyes that I said, I've got to help them. You know, so I started investigating the first two of, well, the third event, and then it led me to investigate the first two. And then because I was writing about both of them, or actually all three events, I had to tell my family. And it was when I told my family about this beloved man. He was the life of the party. He was an amazing storyteller, a great cook. Everyone loved him. And when I told my family about him, something shifted in my life. And I suddenly had agency in my life for the first time since probably I was 8 or 9. And I pretty quickly after telling my family members, I felt my truth in a way that I had never felt it before, because I was ignoring two of the biggest truths, you know, I had ever experienced. So, and accepting everyone else's version of especially this person who had molested me when I was young, and accepting their version meant that I couldn't look at my own truth, and it became very, very easy to disregard it. And as a result of writing my book, I'm a real active player in my own life, and that's beautiful, and it feels wonderful.
So this next question directly addresses those who witness domestic violence and don't know what to do. What would you do? This could be seeing it in public, in private, with a neighbor. It seems obvious, call the police, step in and protect, but there's an astonishingly large number of times that this does not happen. So what would you do if you witness a domestic violence incident? Do you understand why people would not step up, and what advice do you have for them?
It depends on exactly what's going on. I mean, if it's clear if somebody is hitting somebody in front of me, I'm going to call the cops. If I know that somebody is being abused, though, it's such a different story. It's like, I'm afraid of making it worse. For one thing, if I intervene, if I say something, is he going to hurt you more? Can I get some advice to you, or say something to you kind of on the side where he's not going to know, and give you a number for a shelter, you know, if you're a stranger to me. And then if you're a friend, then that's a whole different situation again. And so I don't know about the rest of you guys. I understand sometimes why people don't step in. I think there's a shock, and there's almost a disbelief, like, is this really happening? Maybe it's not, I don't know what to do. And so sometimes we do nothing, which is obviously the wrong thing to do.
Well, I certainly understand the confusion. But what is important to remember is that domestic violence is a crime. And so if you overhear it or you see it, you must call the police right away. Don't intervene yourself because that's dangerous. Call the professionals who are the police. And believe it or not, you're not going to just be helping the victim. You're going to be helping the perpetrator too. Because sometimes both victim and perpetrator are so enmeshed in what's happening that neither one of them realizes that a crime is being committed. So that's the first thing. But the more confusing thing for people is if you suspect that somebody you love or work with or care about is a victim, but it's not happening in front of you, it's really hard to know what to do. And so I'll just pass along what helped me and what I write about in Crazy Love, which is a friend just took me aside in a quiet moment and said, Leslie, something's changed. I need to know that you're safe. I need to know that you're okay. And I want you to know that I'm always here for you. And that's all that it took to break down my denial and to know that I had a friend. And it took me 2 years to leave my abuser, but I knew in that moment that somebody else knew what was happening to me, and that is actually what saved me. So I would recommend being very gentle and non-confrontational and just expressing your love and concern and that you need to know that your friend is okay. And trust me, you'll plant a seed that will help them immeasurably, either right then or over time.
Leslie, that's a really good piece of advice. And I have just a little bit to add to that. When I was attacked in the parking lot for the first time, I had people who witnessed it because when you're a child and you're molested quite often, it's something that happens behind closed doors. So when I was being attacked, a woman witnessed the whole thing, and she thought she was witnessing domestic violence, and instead he was a stranger. And so afterwards, as I was picking myself off of the ground, she came up to me and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm okay, it's okay." And she looked me straight in the eye and she said, "It's not okay, and you're not okay. I saw it." And seeing it through her eyes made me realize that I could no longer ignore these things, that I had someone who bore witness to what had happened. And she told me it's not okay, and kind of woke me up. And that's when I began writing my book. So one of the things I would suggest is bear witness to the person who has experienced domestic violence. If they do come forward and talk to you about it, don't question them, don't second guess them, don't tell them what you would have done or how you would behave. Just bear witness as though it's the most important thing you had to do on that day. Listen as though this person's life depended on it, and most likely it does. So that's, I agree with all of the advice that has been given so far, and that's just, I wanted to add that to it as well.
I love that. I mean, that's absolutely on point. And it's so difficult to, our response changes with our role in witnessing. Is it a daughter? Is it a sibling? Is it a stranger? Is it, maybe we suspect something going on about a coworker that we care about. And so it's never comfortable. And I just so agree that we leave our own judgment out of it, and that we call the police when we know what we've seen. And we certainly don't want to get attached to the outcome, that, we're not going to try to get super frustrated if the victim goes back and if the whole case falls to pieces just when it was getting ready for trial. In the same way, we don't get attached to the outcomes when, let's say, it's a friend, a daughter, or a coworker. And sometimes what I've done, if there's someone I suspect is being very much controlled or abused, but who hasn't come forward with it, is say, do you know where you would refer a friend or someone you cared about who's experiencing abuse in their relationship? Where would that be locally? And then going over some of those referrals. Because I'm not trying to push that person to a point where they're doing something that I wish they would do, like leaving, but I'm trying to make sure that they know that there are people out there who are anonymous, who won't have judgment. And that's what being a domestic violence advocate is. So I love this conversation. It is so important to bear witness, to be able to talk about it, but also to know that we don't have to be the solution to the problem all on our own.
That was really wonderful advice. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to draw more attention to this aspect of when you call the cops, sometimes it can put the person in more danger. Elizabeth, because you are in law enforcement, could you give us more insight on that and what the best way to go about that is?
Correct. And this is such a dicey issue because there really isn't one solution that we can guarantee safety and a positive outcome. But what I like to tell people, if they're being held accountable for abusing someone in my current job, is you understand that the victim did not contact law enforcement. It is the in my state of Alaska versus you. It is not the victim versus you. So it is us who's taking this step because, quite honestly, domestic violence is a menace to society. And so just making that super clear that this is a call that I made if I'm a witness. The police are very careful usually to make clear, if they're doing their due diligence, that they're doing their job, and that job is to definitely intervene. And this is something that the batterer, unfortunately, be it male or female, and we know, speaking of, that in same-sex relationships and in heterosexual, homosexual, and all kinds of relationships, domestic violence occurs, and it's a problem around the world. But we want to make sure that that person understands that in this moment when they committed this crime, that their control that they have so prided themselves in having is gone, and that other people are involved. And again, like I said before, then we also, as witnesses or as friends or family, we want not to get overly invested in what a victim chooses to do, because leaving is not a one-time event. It is a complicated process that sometimes involves many false starts. And we know that it's more dangerous, frankly, just before and just after leaving a violent relationship than it is to stay and keep status quo.
And do you have any personal experience with the reason those being abused sometimes give for staying, but I love them? What would you say to someone who is staying in a domestic violence situation because they love their partner?
I think it goes back to, what was said in the previous conversation, which is just that raising the question, is this really love, or often, maybe more importantly, you deserve to be loved in a different way. A lot of women have come to believe, either been trained by their abuser or grew up in families like this where it's normal, and they think that it's okay for whatever reason, or that they deserve it, that when he hits me it's my fault because I did the thing and he's a good person. And these guys can be very charming, guys and women. I got to bring that back too. I know men who've also been abused. It goes both ways, sadly. But the abuser can be very charming, very loving. And so then we come back to that. It's not easy. So raising that question of, maybe I am worth more, maybe there is something out there for me and it's not okay. Like Leslie said, it's against the law. The law is being broken. This is a criminal act. So raising those questions and just being supportive and lots of love and support instead of telling people what to do.
I agree, Kerry. I think that you cannot love a victim too much. Our self-esteem becomes so fragile that we really need it. And the reason that I called my book Crazy Love is that it feels like love, even though what it really is a psychological trap disguised as love. And what helped me the most to break my isolation and my denial was when the people who I confided in understood and let me know that they did. And my best friend, she said something I'll never forget. She said, I really understand why you love him. And I think that you're lucky to feel so much love. And I just want to make sure that you're safe. So she didn't deny it. She didn't blame me. She didn't tell me I was stupid or I had no self-esteem. She just sort of like crawled into the very dark place where I was with me and held my hand there and comforted me. And in some ways, I owe my life to her and to her sympathy. And so, I think the victims also need to be treated with great respect and to be believed and to be taken seriously, because saying that it's our fault for staying is just a complicated way of blaming the victims. It's not our fault. And in order to get out, what we need more than anything, I believe, is love and sympathy and respect. and advocacy, which is a lot different than getting angry or even blaming the perpetrator. Because I tell you, when you blame the perpetrator and call that person a monster, what we tend to do is say, but wait, no, they're not a monster. You don't understand. I love this person. There's so much good in them. And so to not demonize the abuser and to just to understand as how complex it is. And that's what's great about this panel, is that we're trying to educate people that strong, smart, independent women and men become victims all the time. It can happen to anybody at any point. It's a very complicated, misunderstood situation. And by blaming victims, we do everybody a disservice.
Absolutely. I agree with you completely. And one of the things I'm trying to do in all the silent spaces is change the dialogue around abuse in general, because with my own situation, when I think about it, I loved the man who molested me. And that's often the case. You both mentioned that there is always, there's usually love involved, and that there are good sides to these people. And I think that throws anybody who's experienced violence, because a lot of the times, especially with children, they say, well, this person couldn't have done that. They're so wonderful. Everyone loves them so much. And, when people say that this person is either a monster or a saint, it doesn't allow for the complexities of humans, of being human. Yes, people can do public good and private bad. And in my opinion, we have to acknowledge that as a society. We can't just say, oh, he's either a monster or a saint, because then you have family members who don't believe you. And no wonder they don't believe you. Our society hasn't talked about these complexities. And it's almost as though people have to choose sides. And I know, as a survivor of molestation, that I barely believed it myself because of the narrative we had about this man. And so it's very hard when society is saying it's either or and not yes and.
I love that. I think in the work that I've done as a domestic violence advocate, and then later working in probation, you do get comfortable with saying there are victims and perps. That's it. Well, if you're considered to be a victim, that means that you're weak and that you don't have choices and that you don't, have the strength that really is inside all of us. And if you're only a perp, then what about that great sense of humor? What about that wonderful work ethic? What about that person who's a good parent in a lot of ways? And so it's really important, as all of you brought up, that we look at people as whole humans. And certainly we want to have a war against domestic violence. It's never okay. Doesn't matter how nice or how funny or how whatever the perpetrator is. But on the other hand, that we're able to validate our friend and meet them and hold their hand where they're at and not give that judgment. I love what you said, Leslie, about your friend just being there in the moment and making you feel okay to have that love and validating that experience. That's powerful. When I was with my husband, all of my friendships kind of got cut away from me little by little, and I didn't realize that was happening. And I was very young, and I was teen marriage. And so when things started going south, when things started going badly in my relationship, and where I thought, wow, he doesn't like any of my friends, and he makes horrible comments about my family, I wanted to be on the side of our marriage. And I wanted that relationship to last. And so eventually I found myself without a whole lot of input from much of anyone. And that wasn't that I didn't have friends in my past. It was that he objected to that and their opinion and would make comments. Why are you friends with that person? They're a negative influence. Why this, why that? And so I didn't leave a lot of room for people to get close to say, you're not who you used to be. I'm concerned. I had a babysitting job, ironically, where he did not object to for a little while. And I'd bring my two daughters and babysit these three little boys for an attorney in town, and made the family some money. So he didn't mind that. And the attorney started seeing things and once said to me, you will know when you need to leave this relationship. No one else can tell you when. It will be inside of you. And just listen to the right thing inside yourself. But I believe that inside of you, there is that good judgment and listen to that. And that was pretty powerful.
So the precursor to physical violence is often emotional abuse and control, as abusers groom and test the boundaries of their victims. I think this is a common misunderstanding that if someone isn't hitting you, it isn't domestic violence. Could you give us your thoughts?
My thought is that emotional abuse is just as destructive as physical violence. I've seen it over and over destroy people. And it's actually, in some ways, more treacherous because it's so hard to spot. And, sometimes it's that the person hasn't been hit yet and the physical abuse is coming. But sometimes the abuser has enough control that they can just use emotional and psychological manipulation. Gaslighting, making the victim feel that he or she is crazy, blaming them. This is all still abuse. And unfortunately, in most parts of the world, emotional abuse is not a crime. And I hope that is something that changes at some point. And I think that one of the trickiest things about emotional abuse also is that family court judges can't see it and can't measure it. And family court judges can barely understand physical violence, and it's a huge problem in our family court system. But when you don't have any bruises, it's that much harder to convince somebody who's trying to suss out the sort of he said, she said situation. And so I think that it's something that we must talk about. And it's also much more common than physical violence is emotional abuse. And one of the charities that I'm involved with is a wonderful organization called the One Love Foundation. And what they try to do is focus on just teaching the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships, period, whether there's physical abuse or not. And I think that's something really important to understand, is that love is supposed to feel good and supportive. If you're afraid or mistrustful of yourself or the person who loves you, then I think that's a very important red flag that it's an unhealthy relationship. And you owe it to yourself and your family and your children, if you have them, to take a really long and hard look at what is healthy versus unhealthy love.
That's awesome, Leslie. I love that you call it healthy versus unhealthy. I think that people are much more likely to address the question, if we put it that way, rather than calling it domestic violence, although I'm going on record as saying I think it is domestic violence. I also agree. I think it is so destructive, the emotional abuse, and it's so prevalent, and it's so much easier to kind of dismiss it and explain it away, like it doesn't count, but he didn't hit me, that sort of thing. And then people just are made so small and so miserable by that, and so controlled that it's just almost impossible to break away, because you don't feel that you can or should or deserve or any of those things. So just being able to have a dynamic questioning about it, questions and answers, have a conversation, begin to change the societal take on all of that. And that's hugely important, and probably where all of this starts. If we all are more open about talking about a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy relationship, then that opens all kinds of doors, I think, for people getting free of the physical violence as well.
In my work as a domestic violence advocate back in the day, and I wrote about this a little bit in Pieces of Me, one of the scariest situations I worked with was a woman calling the hotline saying, in a very flat tone, my husband has dug a hole about the size of my body, and he's got a box out, and he says that I would fit into the box. And she said it so matter-of-factly that it was, it's like, what did you say? What did you say? But those kinds of things had been happening for her for such a long time, and yet she'd never been physically touched. And so it is important to look at how emotional abuse is often that precursor, but if the victim leaves that relationship, it could escalate. So it is very serious. As has already been stated, it's definitely leaves scar tissue. And it's harder to be able to call it out and define it, and certainly to get any support from the systems that are supposed to help victims and intervene in domestic violence.
I think everyone here has mentioned defining in some shape or form. And I'm thinking about our society and how our society needs better definitions. They actually, I feel, need the language to talk about these things. And the more we talk about it, the more we'll give them the language that they need. When I was attacked in front of my children, maybe a few days before that, I gave them, or I bought this videotape, and it was about stranger danger. And I kept going back and forth. Should I show them or not? And my argument against showing them was, oh, well, then they'll know that people are out there that could hurt them. And then I thought, but if they're in a weird situation, I want them to know about it. So ultimately, I showed them the video. And right after this man beat me up, my son, who was 3, looked at me and he said, Mom, he was a don't know. And I realized that my children had the vocabulary to talk about this event, that and just by chance, I had shown them this video. And that was really powerful. And as somebody who wants to protect my kids, I realized that the best thing that I could do for them would be to give them the language to talk about things, whatever the topic is. And you know, now they're 17 and 15 and we talk about everything, but that really changed the way I parented. And I think about our society in broader terms and domestic violence in broader terms. We have to change the dialogue. You know, we anyone who's experienced domestic violence, in my opinion, obviously has the right to tell their story, even to a society that doesn't want to hear our stories sometimes. And the more we talk about it, even though it feels strange initially, I hid my stories for, I don't know, years until I was 40. But it empowered me to talk about the stories. And it's changing the way I talk about violence. It's changed the way my kids talk about violence, my husband, and my whole family. You know, it's not something to be ashamed of. And it's something that we need to understand better as a society so that we can be there for people who experience domestic violence or any type of violence. So I feel as though we have that all of our books are doing that. They're putting out this vocabulary for our readers to hear and to digest and take in and make their own. So I think I just am so inspired by all of you.
And Christine, I think it is changing a lot. I feel that the kids now are aware that this is a conversation that happens. And so we're beginning to change things. And I love that, you know, the dialogue is out there and it's shifting.
It is. And I think with the Me Too movement, I think that's such a fascinating movement and that we've all become a part of. But there were so many people who wrote Me Too for the first time in their lives. That was the first time they ever acknowledged Me Too. And that was so hard for a lot of people. You know, and a lot of people wrote Me Too. And I talked to them afterwards and they said how putting those 2 words out there was torture. But ultimately they were glad that they did it. So if we have a whole culture of people who can barely say Me Too, I agree that the dialogue is changing. I agree with you completely, and I'm happy about that. But I still think we have a long way to go, and just honored to be part of this group where we're changing the dialogue.
Thank you so much for everybody for sharing your thoughts with us. To all our viewers, don't forget to subscribe. Crazy Love, All the Silent Spaces, Whisper Me This, and Pieces of Me are available on Amazon, and links are in the description below, as well as links to our panelists' websites, LeslieMorganSteiner.com, ChristineRistaino.com, LAMeredith.com, and KerryAnnKing.com. There will also be a link to an article listing the warning signs and forms of emotional abuse and coercive control that also constitute domestic violence. In 2015, the UK passed a law making coercive or controlling domestic abuse without physical violence a crime punishable by up to 5 years behind bars, which was heralded as a landmark moment. If you or someone you know are in danger or in a domestic violence situation, please reach out for help by calling either the police or a domestic violence hotline. Thank you to our panelists for being with us today, and thank you for all you do to help victims of domestic violence.
Thank you. It's an honor to be in such great company.
I agree. And thank you for giving us a platform.